Have you ever been to Japan? It's quite the popular tourist trap these days. But if you find yourself in Japan and want to walk a lesser-known path, I have a suggestion. Take the train to Yokosuka, walk 30 minutes west of the station, and climb the bucolic mountain steps until you reach a park overlooking the bay. Here, upon a tree-crested hill, you can find a monument to an extraordinary man and his extraordinary journey. Born in England over 400 years ago, he sailed across the Pacific via the Strait of Magellan in a perilous voyage. Only a quarter of the crew survived. In the year 1600, they washed ashore on the islands of Japan. He was taken in by a powerful feudal lord, to whom he would provide his knowledge of the European world. In exchange, he was given a small fief, took a Japanese wife, and is still known today as the English Samurai. His name was... Oh, wait. Have you heard this story before? If this sounds familiar, there's a chance you too have been watching or reading James Clavell's Shogun. Originally published in 1975, the Shogun novel was incredibly popular in its time, selling over 6 million copies in its first 5 years. By then, NBC had commissioned a TV miniseries which featured performances by Richard Chamberlain, Toshiro Mifune, John Rhys-Davies, and even the narration of Orson Welles, whose voice was necessary due to the radical decision not to subtitle the show's Japanese dialogue, only translating certain speeches via narration. An accompanying book of essays from the time, Learning from Shogun, created by contemporary Japanese teachers and historians, claimed that between 20 and 50% of their students had read Shogun, and many credited their entire interest in Japan to the book, even before the show came out. 1980's Shogun TV show earned NBC the highest ratings in its history, and swept the Emmys that year. As the Japanese economy hit the peak of its post-war boom, it seemed clear that the way the world viewed the land of the rising sun would never be quite the same. It's been over 40 years since. A new shogun has arisen, courtesy of FX and the efforts of Justin Marks, Rachel Kondo, and lead actor and producer, the incredible Hiroyuki Sanada, who made his goal for the new incarnation clear early on. Once again, the show has been critically acclaimed, sweeping at the Emmys, and while Japan's economy is not what it once was, the powerful dollar and low cost of living in Japan has spurred international interest in it once again. Shogun is back, and I have been waiting. I watched the 1980s Shogun not when it premiered, I wasn't around then, but in my high school years as I was learning Japanese. I loved it then as a student, and to see it return to the public consciousness is exhilarating. Shogun 2024's acting is nuanced but powerful. Its mise-en-scène is lush with finely researched detail. Its changes to the source material make for a story of complex intrigue and deep human emotion. I want to love Shogun. But there's one tiny scene that no one else has talked about, that's put me in a bit of a bind. I've been waiting all year for someone to talk about it, and it hasn't happened. I've read hundreds of pages of books trying to prove to myself that I'm crazy for giving it this much thought. I want to ignore it, but I can't anymore. If you're of an open mind, then I invite you to join me on my journey to love Shogun, because I want to love Shogun. But I'm not sure I can. At least, not yet. The scene in question comes pretty early in the show, and I wouldn't really consider it a spoiler, but some context is needed to understand it. In this scene, which exists in the book and the 1980 series, Lord Toranaga has summoned Blackthorn to instruct him on the geography of the world. Blackthorn sees this as his chance to turn Toranaga against his ostensible allies, the Portuguese. Portuguese priests are the main foreign presence in Japan at this time, and are dead set against Blackthorn, owing to the conflict between Protestant England and Catholic Portugal. But as far as Blackthorn can tell, the local rulers, like Toranaga, have no idea that the advice of the Portuguese is biased and often untruthful, so he takes this moment to reveal an inconvenient truth, which is subsequently translated for him.
Because we had to avoid a Portuguese base in Macau.
マカオにポルトガルの砦があるゆえと申しておりまする。
Did you catch it? In Mariko's translation? Here, I'll break down the Japanese for you.
マカオにポルトガルの砦があるゆえと申しておりまする。
Still mystified? That's understandable. As far as I know, no one else has picked up on this detail. The problem is Macao. Macao is an exonym, a name given to a place by people who don't live there. The Chinese for this area was, and still is, Omun, the Bay Gate. When the Portuguese came in the 1500s, we are told they asked the name of the area, but since they were pointing, in particular, to a local temple, the Temple of Amagok, it was the temple's name that they were given. Ever since, Magok, or Macao, has been the Portuguese name for the entire area of Omun. Even though in the modern day the two are somewhat synonymous, one imagines this is mostly because of the hundreds of years of the Portuguese using the name they acquired by misunderstanding. One of the qualities of Japanese, especially in the 16th century but even now, is that Chinese characters can be used in Japanese writing. They are pronounced differently from Chinese but mostly carry the same meanings. Because of this, we can see that the Japanese would have their own way of translating Omun. They would have called it Omon. You can see the close resemblance. So why are they calling it Macao? Now it may seem like I'm making a big fuss over a harmless historical tidbit, but I'm not here to take the show down. I want to love Shogun, remember? I wouldn't be bringing this up if it was just an incorrect name. It's more than that. It's a plot hole. The only way the Japanese would be using the name Macao is if they'd heard it from the Portuguese. Otherwise, they'd be calling it Omon. Why are the Japanese surprised that the Portuguese, who have been selling them firearms for 50 years, have a fort in the city whose name they only know because the Portuguese told them about it? Okay, maybe you don't think it's important. After all, the characters in Shogun don't even go to Macao, and even if it is a plot hole, it hardly comes up again. Even for the Japanese audience, the older term of Omon is pretty obscure nowadays. It could have been a deliberate decision to make the script more palatable. Even if it was a mistake, what's the harm? We all know what they meant. It's just a name. When was the last time you thought about the name Macao anyways? When you think about it, what do you think of? The Chinese? The Portuguese? The handover in the late 90s when it supposedly changed from being one to the other? Do you think of the casinos? Did you know the casinos are probably only there because of the Portuguese? Do you think of how the Portuguese neutrality in World War II saved a great many Chinese who lived or moved there? My grandparents sheltered there. Without Macao, I might not be here. I think about that. Do you think about Macao as the name imposed on Omun? If I hadn't just mentioned it, would you ever have thought about it that way? Shogun had a chance to think about it, had a chance to put the spotlight on this corner of the world in a way that few shows do. It's not just accuracy or even plot consistency, it's a great cultural opportunity that they passed up. But Shogun isn't about Macao. It's not an introduction to China or even Portugal. It's an introduction to Japan. That's fair. You have to focus when you make a creative work. So let's ask that question. What about the Japanese names? If the intro to this essay left you a little lost, then let me clue you in. This is the grave of William Adams, the first Englishman to travel to and live in Japan. It is not a coincidence that his story and the story of Shogun's John Blackthorne are basically the same. A press release from NBC, released alongside the 1980 series, describes the genesis of Shogun as being directly connected to the story of Adams. And Blackthorne isn't alone. Almost every character in the Shogun book, most of whom also exist in both TV shows, can be connected to a real person. The book Learning from Shogun includes a helpful list, and Wikipedia mirrors it almost exactly. From Tsuki the Jesuit translator, modeled after Father Rodriguez, both of whom were interpreters who adopted names based on their professions, to Ishido Kazunari, modeled after Ishida Mitsunari, both of whom would become the main oppositional force to the man who'd become shogun. That man, Tokugawa Ieyasu, represented by Toranaga Yoshii, is by far the most famous and least ambiguous analog in the cast. Both are powerful feudal lords with their strongholds at Edo. The 2024 series adopts the Tokugawa family's iconic crest, the Aoi no Gomon, in a way so literal as to be identical, where older series merely paid homage to it. Toranaga likes hawking, he spent his childhood as a political hostage, and of course, he meets a foreign sailor and takes him under his protection. At the very least, no one's trying to hide anything. But changing the names does hide something, particularly in the case of the Japanese. To this day, most, if not all, Japanese names are comprised of Chinese characters, kanji, each of whom has a meaning. To change these names is to change that meaning. But going further, each of these names themselves has a story, and the most famous names carried a cultural context, which continue on to this day. This is most evident in the case of Tokugawa Ieyasu. It's not hard even today to find this name echoing through Japan centuries after his death. I guarantee you'll never find a Toranaga ramen at a local store. But moreover, Tokugawa Ieyasu is not a name in the way we understand names today. It was not the name he was bestowed with as a child. It was a long journey to get to this name. The man we know as Tokugawa Ieyasu was born to a branch of the Matsudaira family and given the name Takechiyo, a name always intended to be used only during his childhood. He would spend most of that childhood as a hostage under the neighboring Imagawa clan. The Imagawa were supposedly the liege lords of the Matsudaira, but as you can guess, it was an uneasy alliance, though at that time most alliances were. When Takechiyo turned 15, he was given the adult name of Motonobu. The moto in Motonobu was a gift of sorts. It's the second part of the name of Yoshimoto Imagawa, the feudal lord who was holding Takechiyo hostage and who therefore had raised him for some years. It was a sign of connection between the two, a diplomatic way to strengthen their alliance. When he changed his name again in 1557, he changed it to Motoyasu after his grandfather, Matsudaira Kiyoyasu. In this way, he connected himself back to his own family without entirely discarding or disrespecting the Imagawa clan. It would be 5 years till he would change his name once again to Ieyasu, dropping his connections to the Imagawa clan completely, and upon the advice of a priest, taking on the word Ie, home, family, or clan, creating a new name, the Peaceful Clan. For a man seeking to end the civil war which had raged all his life and confer an image of stability and diplomacy, this name sounds more like a mantra, a fact that was presumably not lost on his contemporaries. This word, Ie, was viewed with such reverence that 10 of the 14 shogun who came after him would adopt this word into their names. 7 years after this, in 1569, he sought permission from the emperor himself to adopt the surname Tokugawa, a name used by one of his ancestors, both to connect him to the glorious deeds of his ancestral branch and to differentiate him from the many branches of the Matsudaira clan around him. He was no longer one of many. His clan would stand the ages. His name was, and has always been, a statement, a mantra of what he stood for. Tokugawa Ieyasu isn't just the answer to a question on a history test. It was a political tool, and it was wielded masterfully. There's a lot of background that Toranaga Yoshi doesn't convey. So why not just use the characters' real names? Clavell, who made up the names in the first place, gives a pretty straightforward answer. Basically, he wanted to be able to bend history, and he thought that Americans wouldn't be able to say the original names. It's also worth noting that this wasn't the first time he'd done this. In fact, all of Clavell's books prior to Shogun followed the same formula of picking a European figure at a historical time in Asia and changing the names of all the relevant persons before adding in a smattering of violence, sex, and other storytelling flourishes. And as a storyteller myself, I don't want to diminish this. That third step of adding flourish is tough, and the success of Shogun suggests that Clavell was pretty good at it. And the idea of changing names so that you don't need to be beholden to history is an interesting one. You get to take all the things you like from history and not be beholden to any details which complicate or slow down your story. You keep the audience guessing as to exactly what's going to happen. It's a fine idea. So why doesn't this happen in European drama? To my knowledge, it's exceedingly rare to see a drama set in historical Europe that takes the same pains to avoid using historical names, even if they do play with history. We saw a particularly prominent example last year in Ridley Scott's Napoleon. Ostensibly the story of Napoleon's rise and fall from power, the film took considerable liberties and was lambasted by the historical community from the moment its first trailer premiered. To this criticism, Mr. Scott famously told the historian in question to get a life. He later emphasized his stance on history by asking all historians, rhetorically, "Were you there? Oh, you weren't there. Well, then how do you know?" It's fair to say that Scott wasn't concerned with history, and perhaps this laissez-faire attitude to accuracy was the movie's downfall, as it hardly made a dent in the awards season and received mediocre reviews from critic and audience alike. If Napoleon was espousing false history, no one seemed convinced or even entertained. But there's no discourse I can find about changing the names of the historical figures, that's for sure. The film is called Napoleon, and the history is the selling point. Zapolitain just wouldn't sell as many tickets, one presumes. But maybe this is only possible because Napoleonic history is so well known, so recent. People know of Napoleon. He lived only 2 centuries ago. There's more reason that people might recognize that name. So what about Wolf Hall? Wolf Hall was a 2015 series chronicling the machinations of Thomas Cromwell, minister to Henry VIII of England in the 16th century, just 60 years or so before the events Shogun dramatizes. It's certainly not the material you remember studying in school. If you live outside England, you may never have heard of these people, so if they kept their names, surely there was a reason relating to history. Wolf Hall's critical reception was quite good. It featured clever writing and a brilliant performance from Mark Rylance in the lead role. Historians were less impressed, though. In fact, some of them were aghast. The show casts Cromwell as a kind of flawed hero, put in a tough spot and trying to make things out in a court full of religious fanatics. The historical Cromwell, some historians allege, was a sadistic Machiavellian madman whose death was something to cheer for. Some even allege that Hilary Mantel, author of the book Wolf Hall, held a grudge against the church, which they used the book and their vision of Cromwell to espouse. According to them, Wolf Hall isn't just inaccurate, it's propaganda. That's a pretty dire state. But you know what Mantel didn't do? They didn't change the names, and they didn't feel constrained by history. This is, in some ways, a blessing. If you want to know what kind of person Thomas Cromwell really was, you can look him up. You can find plenty of people talking about what he did or didn't do. There's no intermediate step of realizing he may have been real, finding out who he may or may not have been. I really couldn't think of any Western historical drama which takes liberties with history and simultaneously alters historical names to do so with more impunity. When I mentioned this to an acquaintance, however, they brought up an interesting counterexample. What about Game of Thrones? Game of Thrones famously takes from history. Its creator, George R.R. Martin, something of a history buff, is not shy about his process of seeking out interesting history, sanding off the serial numbers, as he puts it, and inserting it back into his books. Many commentators have noted the obvious resemblance of his great houses to certain historical families which fought each other during the English War of the Roses. And I need not recount the monumental positive reception and massive cultural impact of Game of Thrones, at least for a time. This seems like an iconic example of a Western name change historical drama, but there are a few things which set Thrones apart from Shogun. First of all, in the same interview where he describes taking from history, Martin clarifies that Thrones' plot is the result of several events from history intertwined. The War of the Roses, the 100 Years' War, the Black Dinner of Scotland, these events didn't happen at the same time or at the same place. Therefore, Martin's characters are not one-to-one recreations the way Shogun's are. Thrones famously takes place in Westeros, a continent which may resemble but is definitely not England. And don't forget the minor addition of the dragons and other elements Martin creates to further his stated goals of welding the grit of history with the imagination of fantasy. In short, Thrones does switch names, but it switches a lot more than that. Thrones is not a historical drama, it's a fantasy. No one watching Game of Thrones imagines that it's the literal history of England, the way they could when watching Wolf Hall. No Western drama I know of is both historically invested and inclined to change its cast's historical names the way Shogun did. If you're not convinced this is weird, please indulge me in a hypothetical. Imagine a TV series called President. It's the story of Johann Weiss von Schwarzdorn, a Prussian military officer who plays a leading role in the American Revolution. See, Schwarzdorn was born into a military family, and he fought in the 7 Years' War, but in the European peace which followed, he was out of work. So he's sought out by Brandon Danklin, a representative of the 13 colonies in the Americas trying to break free from the British Empire, and so, seeking employment and possibly to hide his homosexuality, he flees Europe with his dog, Razor, to a young America. There, Danklin makes introductions, and soon, Schwarzdorn starts training the rebel troops. With barely any knowledge of English, he must lend his Prussian expertise to the young Americans and come to understand their burgeoning new culture, all while fighting the American defector, Eggs Armold, having a spicy affair with Alexandru Hamilton, and eventually befriending Smorge Joshington, the man who would become the first president. Now, some of you might say, I would absolutely watch that show, but once you get over the names, and consider that this hypothetical show would be a self-serious drama, ask yourself, does hearing that summary make you feel odd? If you're not American, or know American history, consider how a version of this taking place in your own country, with all the important names changed, might feel a little unnerving. Even if you don't feel unnerved, consider whether this TV series would ever actually be made. And, sorry, I made a mistake in my critique of Shogun's names. There is one name they don't change. When Mariko asks Blackthorn about his home country, she also asks the name of his queen. He answers, Elizabeth. Wouldn't want to change that. I don't know about you, but I think I'm seeing a pattern. I think it has to do with that thing which sets Shogun apart from these other examples. I think it might involve the Orient. Around the same time the novel Shogun was published, another magnum opus was taking shape. This is Orientalism, the definitive discussion on Orientalism, and the crown jewel of Professor Edward Said. It is one of the densest books I have ever read, so much so that I had to stop reading partway through to move apartments and then start again. But it really is essential reading, and it is soberingly relevant to our modern day. Before reading this book, I thought of Orientalism as a kind of latent racism towards East Asia, that treating Japanese history different from Western history was the result of racist inequalities and that's what made it bad. But Orientalism is far more than that, more far-reaching, more sinister, and more destructive than I had imagined. Said describes Orientalism as a mode of thought. It's a way, as he puts it, that certain countries have attempted to come to grips with countries collectively termed the Orient. A key point of Orientalism is that the peoples and cultures of the Orient are, collectively, a different entity than the peoples and countries of the West. They are the other, and they're different from us. This seems like an innocuous idea, but it's the starting point for a series of insidious truisms which came to influence novelists, philosophers, and politicians for generations. Here are some of them. Orientals are passive. They are objects of study who lack sovereignty or agency. Orientals are exotic, even sensual, a thing to be explored and even exploited with impunity. Orientals are irrational and don't believe the importance of facts and empiricism, as opposed to the cool-headed Europeans who do. Orientals are unchanging. They possess no ability to change any of the aforementioned qualities today or even over hundreds of years. And Orientals are monolithic. Not only are they different from us, but all Oriental peoples are basically the same as each other. One shocking passage on this comes to us from a 1972 article written about the Arabs, which states, "We are told that Arabs stress conformity, that Arabs can function only in conflict situations, that prestige is based solely on the ability to dominate others. The art of subterfuge is highly developed in Arab life, as well as in Islam itself. The Arab need for vengeance overrides everything, otherwise the Arab would feel ego-destroying shame." When I was a child, I had the pleasure of watching Disney's Mulan when it premiered in theaters. As a person of Chinese descent, it filled me with joy to see my culture represented on the big screen, and one aspect of that culture was the idea of honor and shame. Years later, as I studied Japanese, I would take those concepts with me, understanding that even more than in China, Japan was a culture of conformity, that fitting in was one of the most important things to do there, and that when I was unable to, it was only natural to feel great personal shame. For 20 years in Japan and even the States, I've tried to internalize the rules of culture, respect, and honor, and when I screwed up even unintentionally, I felt that truly penitent, permanent shame. I'd failed my culture and myself, and the only thing for it was to try harder. It was a part of who I was. It was a part of my culture. And you're telling me that it just so happens that a culture in the desert halfway across the world just happens to be characterized by the exact same things? Let me tell you, I never expected this labyrinthine textbook to get me so worked up. I can't convey how monumental it is to realize that obsessive honor and conformity and shame don't define those cultures. They don't define me. They don't define anything. It's not that shame and honor and conformity don't exist in East Asia. It's that they exist in Western Europe too. Honor, shame, and conformity are human qualities. They exist in everyone. There is no us or them. There is no Orient in real life. There's only the Orient constructed by Orientalism. You may think that knowing this should be enough to stop Orientalism. But sadly, Said emphasizes, this isn't the way it works. Orientalism is a societal structure that has been supported materially for generations. Money and political power were invested into its promulgation. Its conclusions were essential to justify imperial conquests across the world. And as a result, it isn't just a single lie we can scratch out with a marker. It is diffused into our histories, our philosophies, and our aesthetics. It's a part of our world, even and especially because it was never about a real Orient. It can't be simply disproven because it was never seeking proof. Orientalism is not gone. While the term has fallen out of favor, so-called area specialists have now taken up its precepts. Everyone's favorite former Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, published an essay during his time advising Nixon, talking about the non-Newtonian world, a redressing of the irrational truism which claimed that nations which didn't encounter a Newtonian empirical revolution, a category which conveniently includes any nation not in Europe or America, has no sense of analytical thought. This essay was included in reprints of Kissinger's work into the 21st century. Writing years later, Said would remark sadly on just how little has changed since his book was released. Commenting on the then ongoing American invasion of Iraq, he would blame the debacle not on the dictator who was to be toppled or even on the American president and his cabinet, so much as on the lingering influences of Orientalism and the concept of the other. I'm sure I don't need to explain why this statement is frighteningly relevant in 2024. I believe we have an obligation to try as hard as we can to identify and root out instances of Orientalism in our culture. And historical film is a larger part of culture than you might realize. In his essay, The Historical Film as Real History, Professor Robert Rosenstone highlights the importance of film in how we understand history. How everyone, even professional historians, look to films to give us the rundown of history in areas outside their depth. Films, he says, are a symbol of the post-literate world. Post-literacy is the idea that our society is one in which people can read, but they choose not to. They get their information from audio-visual sources. If this was a new idea in 1995, it's certainly not new anymore. So what does Shogun have to say about the world? And does it teach us about Japan or about the Orient? Most articles on Shogun 2024 are not kind to Clavell's original novel in this regard. I've tried to avoid talking about the novel too critically because, full disclosure, I haven't read it. It would be inappropriate for me to pass judgment. But the people who have read Shogun describe it as quintessentially Orientalist, even learning from Shogun's professors of the 70s, who presumably hadn't read Orientalism, remark on how the book includes wildly inaccurate Japanese, exaggerates via Blackthorn the role of William Adams in the Tokugawa court, and contains some complete fabrications which much more reflect the experiences of Clavell than the experiences of Adams. Japanese historian and editor of Learning from Shogun, Henry Smith, points out that Adams may not even have been the most prominent foreigner to reach Japan on his own ship. The Dutchman Jan Justin also served Tokugawa Ieyasu and was given a fief in the middle of Edo, a far more prestigious part of town than Adam's estate in Miura. You can still see this impact in the Tokyo Underground, where Jan's visage is memorialized in the Yaesu district. More unnerving is the example of the torture scenes, another very early segment in every incarnation of the story. Early on, the local lord, who rescues Blackthorn and his crew, boils one of them alive, seemingly to suit his own sadistic xenophobic whims. This never happened in history. Smith goes so far as to say no Japanese would ever have treated helpless castaways this way. Why would Clavell add this scene? Before he was a storyteller, Clavell served in World War II. He was in fact proud of coming from a long line of British imperialists and felt a connection to the Navy. He was captured and interned by the Japanese at the Changi internment camp in Singapore, where he surely did witness terrifying things. And Smith remarks that many of the opening parts of Shogun read like recollections of these tortures. One can imagine Clavell felt justified in transposing the terrors the Imperial Japanese Army inflicted into a historical Japan. But that only makes sense if you think that the Japanese are an unchanging people. Anthropology professor David Plath described the overall effect of Shogun as taking us beyond Japan into an entirely different country. There we find a culture that resembles 16th century Japan, but with all the pieces rearranged. A place that doesn't really exist. Blackthorn, in this conception, begins to look less and less like an Elizabethan who went to the other side of the world in 1600, and more like an American who fell into a time reverse warp around the year 1970. It seems very much like the well was poisoned. Some claim the 1980s series to be even worse, with one Clifford Ueda, former president of the Japanese American Citizens League, saying that its captivating costumes and photography were mere settings in which subtle racism was beamed into the subconscious mind. But the same article, which described the original novel as laden with lazy stereotypes and Orientalism, declares that Shogun 2024 coalesces into a story that is both historically and artistically more authentic in time and place than its source material, and even, I'd hazard to say, any previous depiction of Japan in Western cinema and television. So the question is, has Shogun 2024 purified the water of the poisoned well? Is Shogun 2024 still Orientalist? We have no reason to doubt the good intentions of the creatives behind Shogun 2024. Hiroyuki Sanada's mantra, that Shogun should introduce his culture, is embodied in his dedication to his dual roles as lead actor and producer of the show. His life as a Japanese man is surely embodied in Shogun. Justin Marks and Rachel Kondo talk at length about their early skepticism of the project, how they grappled with the aged nature of the source material and sought to modernize it, which sounds like a charitable way to say they wanted to reduce its Orientalist leanings. But good intentions don't guarantee good results. Said presents multiple examples of individuals whose good intentions were still restricted or co-opted by Orientalism in their societies. James Balfour, a British Prime Minister, gave a long speech to the House of Commons, talking about the grandeur of Egyptian civilization. But this speech, which emphasized Britain's extensive knowledge of Egypt, and therefore emphasized Britain's obligation to use that knowledge to steward Egypt, ended up as justification for Britain's Egyptian occupation. Karl Marx, maybe you've heard of him, was nothing if not the original man of the people. He attempted to extend his notions of the suffering of the working class to the peoples of India, but found himself ultimately concluding that it was okay for them to suffer because of their Oriental nature. Good intentions alone were not enough to break free from Orientalism. We must examine the content of the work the people made. And it is in this content that Shogun delivers. The changes Shogun 2024 makes are broad and fascinating. By subtitling the Japanese dialogue, we can now observe the misunderstandings of Blackthorn as they play out and peer into the thoughts of his Japanese hosts. Many scenes are focused entirely on the Japanese, which has led many to, for the first time, argue that Blackthorn isn't the protagonist of Shogun anymore, even though his struggles to adapt to Japanese culture are still at the core of the series. One scene I found particularly fascinating comes slightly later in the story, though again, I don't consider this a huge spoiler. In this scene, Bundaro, husband to Mariko, has beaten her within Blackthorn's house in Japan. Blackthorn, who has feelings for Mariko and a general humanistic opposition to such violence, chastises Buntaro, and they confront each other outside the house. Here's the 1980s version. I'll take the liberty of adding English subtitles for the Japanese, since the original show doesn't provide them. These are my own translation.
An apology was required, whether he meant it or not. Face had to be saved for both of them.
別れます。酒。Too much sake. 怒り。酒が過ぎたようでござる。はい、別れます。しかし、酒の上とはいえ、やはり拙者の無礼。何卒お許しを。どうも。
You can see here that the scene is framed as a resolution, the culmination of cultural know-how that Blackthorn has acquired, allowing him to de-escalate and resolve the quarrel peacefully. Here's the same scene from the 2024 version.
Oh, what are you doing? Get up!
その方の屋敷の輪を乱してしまうな。何卒ご勘弁を。酒。
Sake! Is that your excuse? Get up, you bastard! On your feet!
Sake が優位に。
Sake. You piece of shit.
Here we see Blackthorn in one of his lowest moments. Full of rage, he tries to coax a fight with Buntaro, who instead effects an apology, and all but forces Blackthorn to back down. We see Blackthorn come to the same conclusions as his 1980s counterpart. He understands the same amount of what's happening around him. But this time, he also understands that the culture which surrounds him is out of his control. He's a stranger in a strange land, and nothing he can do will change that. Subsequently, where he once would have let his rage drive him to lash out blindly at this world, he does back down. He realizes where he is, and in some way, even reluctantly, he starts to understand the people around him. The first few times I went to Japan, I felt an aura about the place. It was in part the place I'd imagined, the beautiful vistas I'd seen in the anime of the time brought to life. My understanding of Japanese was rudimentary, but I knew enough to convey my sentiments to people and felt like they were relieved not to speak English. Japan back then felt like a place that I could resolve. As I returned over the years, my Japanese got better, and as a tourist I could get around without issue. Feeling as though kindness and politeness would serve me through any occurrence, I took the liberty of arranging some professional business in Japan. That experience has stayed with me ever since. It's one thing to go to a place with tourism money and ask to give it to someone, or politely ask if they can take your picture. It's quite another to ask someone else for something, an introduction or a favor. That day, I became aware of several social mores I had unwittingly violated, towards people I admired and respected. The Japan of pleasantries I thought I knew wasn't real, and the Japan that I was in didn't exist for my tourism, my amusement, or my politeness. That was the first time I wanted to come back to America, and unlike Blackthorn, I at least had that choice. This outlook permeates throughout the series. There is something not just of real Japan, but of the real experience of being there, of coming to terms with it, in this show. It is a tremendous improvement on the cultural side. The show even changes the most egregiously incorrect sounding names to more authentic ones. The iconic example here being Yabushige, who is referred to in the 1980s series and the book as Yabu, a very strange name in Japanese, as most Japanese names have more than 2 syllables, and even the word Yabu sounds awfully close to yabai, the word for something bad. What's interesting about Yabushige is that no one seems to agree what historical person he's based on. The Learning from Shogun book lists him and his son Omi as completely fictional characters. The Shogun 2024 wiki says he may be based on Honda Masanobu, a retainer of Ieyasu who switched sides from time to time and therefore casts Omi as Masanobu's historical son, Masazumi. No details of Honda Masazumi's biography really match that of Omi's, except that he was the son of Honda Masanobu. Ultimately, FX's Shogun keeps most of the names from the book, but if you compare the characters to their historical counterparts, you quickly find that their actions are more ahistorical than they've ever been. Indeed, one part of Shogun which isn't changed is the questionable specifics of the history. When I watched Shogun 2024, my roommate asked me how much of it was real. I replied that it was mostly made up besides the characters, but as I thought about it, I realized I didn't know that to be true for sure. My knowledge of the specific time period Shogun focuses on, the year 1600 after the death of the previous ruler of Japan, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, but before the Battle of Sekigahara when Tokugawa Ieyasu definitively united the country, is a bit of a blind spot for me. As of this writing, the analogous section of Ieyasu's lengthy Wikipedia page has 4 paragraphs devoted to this time, the gist of which is to say that the country was splitting into pro- and anti-Ieyasu camps, and then they went to war. It also contains 0 mention of Hosokawa Gracia, the character connected to Mariko, which might lead a casual viewer of the show to ask whether Mariko too was fictional. As Rosensohn says, when outside our depth, we inevitably turn to film to fill in the blanks. The fact that I, an interested party in every sense, couldn't easily assess the historicity of the events of 1600 was distressing. It seemed to me that the only way to assess Shogun's deviations from history was to learn the history itself, to learn the truth of Shogun. The definitive English book on Tokugawa Ieyasu is a biography written in 1937 by A.L. Sadler, which has conveniently been retitled Shogun, The Life and Times of Tokugawa Ieyasu, in its more recent reprintings. Given how long it's been around, it's almost certain Clavell read it when he did his research on Shogun. In fact, I'm almost sure he did, because unlike Wikipedia, Sadler's recounting of Ieyasu's life in the year 1600 includes the arrival of the Dutch ship Leifte, formerly known as the Erasmus, in its lead up to Sekigahara, and in the following pages it takes the time to describe the life of Hosokawa Gracia. Hosokawa Gracia was born Akechi Tama, daughter of Akechi Mitsuhide, the general who betrayed and killed Oda Nobunaga, all events which are reflected in the show. She was married to Hosokawa Tadaoki. Their relationship was a strained one, although the cause was not Adam's, rather it was her Catholicism. Ironically, Tadaoki had told her about the religion as a friend of his had tried unsuccessfully to proselytize to him. She was enraptured and snuck out to be baptized, by which she obtained the name Gracia. Tadaoki punished the woman of the house for assisting her, possibly cutting off someone's ears and nose for the transgression. Eventually, Tadaoki left to fight for Ieyasu and confined Gracia to his house. While away, Ishida attempted to apprehend her as a hostage. Rather than be taken, stories say that Gracia committed suicide, showing her resolve not to be taken by the enemy. Sadler is unconvinced of this, saying suicide would have been a grave sin against her Christian beliefs, and believes one of her retainers was likely ordered to kill her, rather than be taken. Either way, her sacrifice made Ishida think twice about making hostages of the other families, and paved the way for Ieyasu to take more drastic action. But importantly, while her acts helped Ieyasu diplomatically, it was not on his orders that this happened. Ieyasu likely never met Gracia, and of course, she never met William Adams. This seems compelling evidence that Shogun's gone a bit astray from the truth. But while he is a prominent source, Sadler didn't get it all right. Introductions to the most recent edition of the book point out how much trust he puts in sources of questionable bias, and very occasionally, you can see his own Orientalism bleed into the work in uncomfortable fashion. Tadaoki in particular is an interesting case. In Learning from Shogun, Japanese professor Chieko Mulhern explains that Gracia's conversion put Tadaoki in a very awkward situation, as it occurred shortly after an edict specifically prohibiting conversions of this kind. In fact, Tadaoki had risked his life and the prominence of his entire clan by hiding Gracia in the years after her father's betrayal. And unusually for his time, after Gracia's passing, he never remarried. The cruel depictions of him may in fact owe themselves to slander from the Jesuits, who had obvious biases against the man who opposed their Catholic conversion. Even the nose and ear cutting, if they did occur, would have been standard punishments meted out by judges of this time. Tadaoki, portrayed by Clavell and Sadler as a complete brute, may not have been that at all. Far more people will watch Shogun 2024 than will read the Shogun book, and the series seems like a great improvement. But if that's all they see, as Rosenstone notes, that may well become the truth of Japan for them. How many Shogun viewers have the time or interest to read 350 pages of Sadler just looking for the real truth? How many will watch this video, or even watch 15 minutes of a far more famous YouTuber explaining the truth? Did Sadler even know the truth? Can anyone know the truth of what happened to William and Gracia and Ieyasu 400 years ago? Are we doomed to never bridge that gap? Is a story all we'll ever know? The story of William Adams has actually been told many times, long before Clavell. Henry Smith chronicles these stories in Learning from Shogun, starting just a few decades after Adams' departure, when his letters back to England painted him as a successful sailor who's featured in a chronicle of explorers. At that time, he was an icon of adventure in a quickly expanding world. In the 1800s, one William Dalton pulled Adams' name out again as a pioneer of British imperialism in the Far East, certainly a subject on the minds of the Victorian-era British public, but far from the mind of Adams, now dead for 200 years. In the late 1800s, Adams' image was revived in a new context, that of the Anglo-British alliance against Russia. Now he was an icon of the two countries' long bonds. It was in this spirit that the monument which still stands at his grave was made, not by the British, but by the Japanese themselves. And then of course there was Clavell. Clavell claimed not to have read any of these previous depictions, but his work fits right alongside them, for Clavell is writing alongside the rise of Japan on the world stage. His audience is seeking to understand Japan, perhaps for the first time in the long history of Adams' legend. Clavell is the one to change Adams' name to Blackthorn, to intertwine his story with that of Hosokawa Gracia. But really, how long had it been since we were learning about Adams in the first place? Maybe we were always dealing with a Blackthorn of a sort, a story rather than a man. Is that even so uncommon? I have to come clean. When I opened this video talking about my trip to visit Adams' grave, I made it sound like a smooth affair, like anyone could choose to make an impromptu trip to see him. That's not quite how it was. And if you do want to get literally as close as you can to what remains of Adams, I owe it to you to give a more complete set of steps to follow. Step 1. Take the Yokosuka line to its namesake stop. There's actually a stop called Anjinzuka that's a little closer, but my train didn't pass there and it's unlikely yours will either. Step 2. Start walking down the street, then realize you're going the wrong way. Turn around and make sure you go over the railway crossing, not away from it. Step 3. Follow Google Maps until you find a lovely little river path and think, this must be it. Step 4. See these lovely steps and think, oh, that looks like the right direction. What a great shot. I think there's even a sign saying the park is this way. Step 5. The park was not this way. All these steps are bringing you to is a tropical prison that's making the already unbearable humidity a truly special kind of hell. You can no longer tell where your skin ends and your sweat begins. Step 6. Reach a fork in the road. Conclude that the street probably has no sidewalk and may not lead to the park anyways, so go left down an incredibly slippery path and note that Google now has no idea where you are. You can no longer tell where your sweat ends and the air begins. Step 7. Meet a cat. Remember the boy at home. You can't get lost. You have a sweet boy who's waiting for you. Google can't help you now. Just find some steps. Pray to the spirit of William Adams that they're gonna get you out of here. Step 8. Find the sign to a local library. Confirming Google knows where you are again. Keep climbing. Step 9. The path is blocked. You've come all this way for nothing. It's not the answer we were looking for, but nothing for it but to just go on back and... Step 10. Walk down the other path. How many steps can one mountain possibly have? Wonder to yourself if getting a little lost on the way to your destination could be a part of William Adams's plan for any stray foreigners who wish to pay homage to his memory. Wonder to yourself if Adams saw a shoreline like this all those years ago. different ships, different buildings, no high-rise that bears his name, but maybe it was, in some ways, the same shoreline that he saw. Step 11. Appreciate how far we've come. Even this more lengthy recollection of my path to Adams edits things out for time, interest, and clarity, so in some ways it's only my story of what happened. Does that invalidate its worth? Film, says Rosenstone, neither replaces written history nor supplements it. We must begin to think of history on film as closer to past forms of history, as a way of dealing with the past that is more like oral history, or the history told by bards or griots in Africa, or history contained in the classical epics. Perhaps film is a post-literate equivalent to the pre-literate way of dealing with the past, of those forms of history in which scientific documentary accuracy was not yet a consideration, forms in which any notion of fact was of less importance than the sound of a voice, the rhythm of a line, the magic of words. The more I reflect on what Shogun is today, the more excited I become. FX's Shogun has been so successful that, in modern Hollywood style, it's been renewed for 2 more seasons. This is unprecedented in Shogun's history. Neither the 1980s series nor Clavell's novels have direct sequels, but history offers us ample material. I can't wait to see the siege of Osaka Castle, though I imagine this event will probably be saved for the climax of the 3rd season, as it was one of the last events in Ieyasu's life. More than that, I want to see the arrival of a character inspired by John Serres, the Englishman who came to Japan after Adams with instructions to work with him, and found Adams to be more Japanese than English. What a way to highlight the difficulties of bridging the gap between cultures. And without the obligation to adhere to history, Marx and Kondo can take all the relevant events of the next 15 years and rearrange them to their liking. In fact, by the time Serres reached Japan, Queen Elizabeth had passed away, meaning there's even an opportunity for Shogun to change its one untouched name by making up an alternate James I, definitively separating their world from the world of history. The more they do this, the more I can clearly say Blackthorne is not Adams. He's becoming a dramatis personae, less Joaquin Phoenix's depiction of Napoleon, and more Sean Bean's iconic performance as Ned Stark, who echoes Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York, but is definitely not the same person, nor should he be. The casual viewer doesn't replace English history with that of Game of Thrones, but so deep and rich is that world of ice and fire that many will choose to investigate it and by proxy learn about their own world. If Shogun's historical inaccuracy is one of its faults, then it is overcome by its greatest achievement, of being through and through a brilliant piece of genre. I would never have done the reading I have if not from a need to love Shogun wholeheartedly, to prove that my engagement with it was warranted. It pushed me, and I'm sure it will push many others, to deepen their relation to Japan. I think it could still do a better job. It's not perfect, but that's been said of it before. The Learning from Shogun book was written slightly before the 1980 TV show came out, but it includes a short epilogue with the thoughts of Henry Smith, who was, after all, the book's editor, on the series, which are not that positive. He laments its simplifications and shortcomings relative to the book, the same way I've remarked on FX's differences from history. But even there, Smith finds, at first begrudgingly and then more sincerely, the good in the Shogun TV show of the era. If only as the world's costliest language lesson, he says, the TV Shogun left millions of Americans knowing far more about Japan than before. Indeed, for all the shortcomings of Shogun the novel, its lasting impact is not its Orientalism, but its message, its attempt to bridge cultures. Perhaps that is the one thing that has truly spanned the ages of Adam's story, too. When Smith remarks, perhaps I'm being impatient and idealistic in my disappointment with the TV version of Shogun, perhaps he speaks for all of us, who would all like this story to reach its ultimate conclusion a little faster. But his last words contextualize that thought for everyone. Deep-rooted cultural biases cannot be broken down overnight, and Shogun, like its parent novel, offers a hopeful foundation on which to build the deeper cross-cultural understanding. I mentioned before that Orientalism was such a lengthy book I had to pick it up twice. The second time I acquired it, I got a different version than I started with. This version of the book included a passage by Said discussing the Iraq War as it was occurring in his present 25 years after his book was first published. He laments how little had changed, but he also reaffirms his belief in the worth of what Orientalism set out to do. He says that this is not blind optimism. It isn't at all a matter of being optimistic, but rather of continuing to have faith in the ongoing and literally unending process of emancipation and enlightenment that, in my opinion, frames and gives direction to the intellectual vocation. We are on a journey to Japan and to all other corners of the world. This journey towards understanding has lasted hundreds of years, and it's ongoing. We may not get there in this lifetime, but we're still moving forward. Shogun keeps moving forward, and I keep moving forward too. On this most recent trip to Japan, there was no aura for me. Sometimes I missed that rush of watching the world's costliest Japanese lesson, but in its place was a sense of Japan and its people as just people. My Japanese is not fluent or profound, but it was enough to navigate smoothly through every situation, and when I did mess up, I took it upon myself to figure out what I'd done. But we can't get held up on those missteps. After all, we have a train to catch. We can't leave Japan without paying tribute to the man of the hour. When I first visited this shrine, I was barely 13 and could barely speak Japanese. We were on a tour bus, and being before the smartphone era, I have no photos of that time. But I remember distinctly that I never walked the entirety of the shrine, never reached the mausoleum where Ieyasu's final resting place lies. Today, almost 20 years after, let's see if we can't get a little closer to the man. According to Sadler, Tokugawa Ieyasu had a taste for information and for literature. But he was not a fan of flowery works like the Tale of Genji. In fact, one of his favorites was a book called the Azuma Kagami, which chronicles the exploits of Minamoto no Yoritomo, the first shogun of the Kamakura shogunate. Ieyasu loved to talk about Yoritomo, and modeled himself in Yoritomo's image. Yoritomo lived about 400 years before Ieyasu. In many ways, the Azuma Kagami was the shogun novel of Ieyasu's time. It was biased and almost certainly embellished, but it connected Ieyasu to Yoritomo, and it obviously served him well. I like to think Ieyasu would have enjoyed this video. Sadler tells us that he loved obscure questions and discussions, particularly those that one of his scholarly advisors, Hayashi Razan, would start just when the more conventional scholars would try to avoid starting a discussion of any kind. If that isn't my mantra, I don't know what is. Ieyasu was one of the most famous Japanese men to ever live, and his mausoleum is one of the most resplendent in all Japan. But it has a rather prominent shortcoming of its own. If you look at this column closely, you may notice it's the only one with its patterning pointing in the wrong direction relative to all the others. This is the reversed column, purposefully installed upside down, because no product of humanity can be truly perfect, and claiming as much invites misfortune. We should not try to claim perfection, but we can cherish our journey towards it. How beautiful that journey has been. It's a journey I think I can love. No, don't eat the microphone. Shame meow. Good boy.